After leaving the sheriff's office, John sat in his truck in the parking lot, frustration mounting as he reviewed his dwindling options. The certified letter had been signed for but ignored. The HOA board members were too intimidated to help, and now even the law seemed to offer only slow, uncertain remedies. His phone buzzed with a text from Mike. "Any luck with the sheriff?" John typed back, "Says it's a civil matter. Could take months." The response came quickly. "That's bull. Want me to bring some friends over? We could move it tonight." The offer was tempting. Mike's college buddies were strong farm kids who could probably manhandle the camper off his property in under an hour. But John knew that vigilant action, however justified it felt, would only hand Patricia legal ammunition. "No," he replied. "We do this right." On the drive home, John took a detour past the community college where he occasionally taught agricultural workshops. Professor Sandra Martins, who headed the legal studies program, was just leaving the faculty parking lot when he pulled in. "John Miller, as I live and breathe," she called, walking over. "What brings you to campus? Planning another sustainable farming seminar?" After explaining his predicament, Sandra's expression grew serious. "She's counting on your frustration," she said. "People like that win by wearing down reasonable folks until they either give up or overreact." "So what's the alternative?" John asked. "Creative compliance," Sandra replied with a hint of mischief. "You can't touch her property, but you can use your land however you see fit, right? The law expects you to continue normal farm operations." The seed of an idea that had been germinating in John's mind since seeing the negotiator nudge his pocket suddenly sprouted into a clear plan. He thanked Sandra and headed to the farm supply store with renewed purpose. That evening, John walked his property line with a GPS tracker, meticulously documenting the exact boundaries. He reviewed the county's right to farm ordinances, confirming what he already knew. Agricultural operations had priority over residential complaints about normal farming activities, including livestock management. At the kitchen table, John spread out his pasture rotation maps. He'd planned to move the cattle to the north field next, but the east field was due for grazing soon anyway. Adjusting the schedule by a week or two wouldn't harm the overall system. He called his neighbor Ed. "Remember that mobile electric fencing setup you used last summer? Mind if I borrow it?" "This for your HOA situation?" Ed asked knowingly. "Let's just say I'm implementing an alternative dispute resolution strategy." Ed chuckled. "I'll drop it off tomorrow." And John, "Take pictures." As darkness fell, John stood at his kitchen window, watching the distant shape of the camper glowing faintly in the moonlight. He tried reason. He tried official channels. He'd even tried community pressure. Patricia had countered each move with dismissal and disrespect. Tomorrow, he'd try speaking a different language, one native to this land long before subdivisions and HOAs existed. It wasn't the solution he'd initially wanted, but it was the one Patricia had earned through her persistent refusal to recognize the simplest of boundaries. The distant lowing of his cattle in the barn seemed almost like a vote of approval for what was to come. They were, after all, about to become unwitting ambassadors in a uniquely rural form of conflict resolution, one that no HOA manual had ever thought to address. John stood on Patricia's porch, the door firmly shut in his face, and took a deep breath to steady himself. Through the decorative glass panels, he could see her retreating figure heading deeper into the house. The urge to pound on the door again was strong, but that wasn't his way. Instead, he pulled out his phone and snapped several photos of her property, the fence line, and the trampled path leading to his field. Evidence he hoped wouldn't be necessary, but knew better than to neglect collecting. As he turned to leave, the door of the neighboring house opened, and a middle-aged man in pressed khakis stepped out cautiously. "Excuse me," he called softly, glancing nervously at Patricia's house. "Are you here about the campus situation?" John paused. "You know about that?" The man introduced himself as Richard Clement, HOA treasurer. "Look, I can't officially talk to you about this," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "but some of us on the board aren't comfortable with what Patricia did. She didn't exactly get approval." "You mean the HOA didn't authorize her to trespass on my property?" John's voice carried just enough that Richard winced. Please lower your voice. Patricia has a security camera. Richard gestured toward a small device tucked under the eaves of her house. She pushed through a bylaw last year prohibiting RVs in driveways or visible from the street, knowing full well she'd need somewhere to put hers. So she made a rule she knew she couldn't follow, then decided my property was the solution. John felt his temperature rising again. Richard nodded miserably. She presented it to the board as having made arrangements with the adjacent rural property. We assumed she meant she paid you for storage. John's eyebrows shot up. She's charging you all fees to enforce these rules, isn't she? $300 for a first violation, Richard confirmed. I got fined last month for leaving my garbage can visible from the street on a non-collection day. The pieces were falling into place. Patricia had created a problem, appointed herself the enforcer, profited from the penalties, and then exempted herself from the consequences by simply commandeering John's land. It was manipulative genius of a sort, he had to admit. Interesting, John said, his farmer's patience now layered with determination. Thank you for telling me this. Back in his truck, John found himself gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. This wasn't just about a camper anymore. It was about entitlement taken to an extreme he couldn't ignore. He thought about his own father, who'd worked 7 days a week to keep this land in the family, who'd taught him that property, like reputation, had to be defended or it would be lost. As he drove past the east field, John slowed to observe the camper again. A bright pink flamingo lawn ornament had appeared beside it. Patricia had apparently made a return visit to add decorative touches to her illegal parking spot. The flamingo seemed to smirk at him, its plastic form a garish intrusion on the natural landscape. That settled it. Diplomacy would still be his first approach, but John now understood he wasn't just dealing with thoughtlessness. This was calculated disrespect, and while he was patient man, he was no pushover. He pulled out his phone again and called the county assessor's office. It was time to make absolutely certain that the property line markers were accurately placed. Then he'd call his cattle veterinarian, supposedly just for the upcoming vaccination schedule, but also to ensure he had an expert witness for the health and safety of his animals during what might become a complicated situation. The flamingo continued its plastic vigil as John drove away, but its days, like those of the camper it guarded, were numbered in ways Patricia couldn't begin to imagine. John stood motionless at the edge of his field, the coffee in his mug now cold, as he surveyed the damage. The pristine white camper, easily 30 feet long, with slide-out sections and satellite dish, looked obscenely out of place against the backdrop of his ancient oak trees and rolling pasture. Its gleaming surface reflected the morning sun with an intensity that seemed deliberately confrontational. Unbelievable, he muttered, setting his mug down on a fence post to get a closer look. As he approached, John catalogued each offense: the flattened grasses where they'd driven through his hayfield, the muddy ruts that would take months to fully heal, the arrogant assumption that his livelihood was less important than someone's recreational storage needs. His land wasn't just dirt and grass. It was the culmination of decades of careful stewardship, each acre meticulously maintained for optimal yield and sustainability. Reaching the camper, John circled it slowly. A premium Grand Design Solitude, if he wasn't mistaken, the kind that cost more than what most people in the county made in a year. The license plate confirmed his suspicions about its owner. HOA BOSS vanity tags on a vehicle registered to Patricia Winters. He'd seen her holding court at town meetings, always impeccably dressed and quick to voice concerns about how agricultural operations like his were outdated and detrimental to the area's growth potential. Thunderhead ambled over, his massive black form moving with surprising grace for a 2,000-pound animal. The bull snorted at the camper, his breath fogging in the cool morning air. I know, boy. It doesn't belong here, John agreed, patting the bull's broad forehead. Back at the farmhouse, John's phone rang. It was Ed Johnson from the neighboring property. That new I saw in your east field, that got something to do with your operation? Ed asked without preamble. Not even slightly, John replied. Seems our HOA neighbor decided my land was free storage. Ed whistled low. Bold move. What are you planning to do? John watched through his kitchen window as a red-tailed hawk circled above the field, hunting for breakfast. Life on the farm had taught him patience, when to act quickly, and when to wait for the right moment. His father had always said, "There's fast time and farm time, and knowing the difference keeps a man sane." "First, I'm going to have a conversation," John said finally. Clear, direct, and neighborly. And if that doesn't work, Ed knew John well enough to hear the restrained anger in his voice. John thought of his cattle, of Thunderhead's curious inspection of the intruding vehicle, of the upcoming rotation schedule for his pastures. A plan began forming, one that honored both farm time and the natural consequences of disrespect. "That I'll let the farm speak for itself," he answered, a smile spreading across his weathered face. "I've got 20 head of Angus that are always looking for something interesting in their day." After hanging up, John changed into his good flannel shirt, the one without feed stains or tractor grease, and pulled his least worn boots from the mudroom. If he was going to start this confrontation with civility, he'd make the effort to look the part. But as he climbed into his truck to drive around to the subdivision entrance, he couldn't help thinking that Patricia Winters had no idea what she'd started by turning his east field into her personal parking lot. Some lessons couldn't be taught with words alone. Sometimes they needed to be delivered with hooves and hides, and the patient persistence that only a herd of cattle could provide. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the east field as John and Mike made final adjustments to the fence line. They had strategically positioned the solar-powered charger where it would be visible from Patricia's backyard, a silent statement that this was indeed active farmland with proper management in place. "Think we should put up a sign?" Mike asked, securing the final connection. "You know, caution, electric fence or something." "Already done," John replied, pointing to the newly posted warnings that bordered the property line at regulation intervals. Everything by the book. They stepped back to survey their work. The temporary fencing created a perfect perimeter around the field, including the camper. True to their plan, they'd left exactly 10 feet of clearance around the vehicle, enough that no reasonable person could claim they were restricting access, yet close enough that accessing the camper would require navigating through the herd's domain. "Time for the welcoming committee," John said, heading toward the adjacent field where the cattle had been waiting. The negotiator led the procession, head held high as if he understood his role in the unfolding drama. Behind him came the rest of the herd. Daisy, the oldest cow, whose calm demeanor kept the younger animals in line. The mischievous yearling twins John had named Thunder and Lightning for their tendency to race across the pasture during storms. And 16 other Angus of varying ages and temperaments. Mike opened the gate, and John called softly to the negotiator. The big bull turned his massive head, then ambled toward John with the others following in a dark, moving river of muscle and hide. "That's it," John encouraged. "New field today, boys and girls. Fresh grass and a new attraction." The cattle moved with unhurried curiosity into the east field, some immediately lowering their heads to sample the lush grass, others moving toward the camper with inquisitive snorts. The negotiator, always the explorer, was first to approach the unfamiliar object, giving it a thorough sniff before rubbing his substantial shoulder against the corner of the fence surrounding it. "Careful there," John cautioned, though he knew the fence was sturdy enough to prevent actual contact with the camper. The last thing he needed was legitimate property damage claims. Within minutes, the herd had established itself throughout the field. 2 younger cows discovered the camper cast excellent shade and promptly settled beneath the extended awning Patricia had left open. Another trio found the disturbed earth where the camper had been parked made for excellent dust bathing, creating a muddy wallow that would soon encircle the entire vehicle. "They look right at home," Mike observed, leaning against the fence. "How long do you think before she notices?" John checked his watch. If she keeps to her usual schedule, she should be heading over after her HOA meeting. I'd say within the hour. "Mind if I stick around? Blake and Tyler are coming by too." Mike's college roommates had grown up on farms themselves and had been following the camper saga with great interest. "The more witnesses, the better," John agreed. "This is all perfectly legal, but I'm not taking chances with how she might try to spin it. As if on cue, the negotiator let out a long, low moo that echoed across the field. Several cows answered in kind, creating a chorus of bovine commentary that carried easily to the subdivision. I think they approve, Mike grinned. John nodded, watching as his cattle settled in around the camper, transforming it from an intrusive eyesore to merely another feature in their pastoral landscape, albeit one surrounded by increasingly numerous cow patties. Patricia wanted country living, John said, satisfaction evident in his voice. Well, she's about to get the full authentic experience. Patricia's confrontation at the fence line had drawn an audience. Word traveled fast in rural communities, and by sunset, a small gathering of locals had assembled at the edge of John's property. They maintained a respectful distance, but their presence, folding chairs and coolers suggesting they'd settled in for the evening's entertainment, clearly unnerved Patricia. "This is harassment," she declared, phone held high as she recorded the scene. "I'm calling my attorney." "Feel free," John replied calmly. "I can put him in touch with the county agricultural board if he has questions about standard grazing practices." The cattle, now acclimated to their new environment, had created a living obstacle course around the camper. The negotiator had claimed the prime spot directly in front of the camper door, while several others had worn comfortable depressions in the earth around the perimeter. What had once been a clean path to the camper was now thoroughly churned into muddy terrain, dotted with fresh cow patties that steamed slightly in the cooling evening air. Patricia's phone call produced no immediate results, leaving her standing awkwardly at the fence line as dusk settled over the field. Finally, she thrust her phone into her designer handbag and fixed John with a glare that might have withered a lesser man. "You think you're clever, don't you? Using your smelly beasts to block me." Her voice carried across the field, causing several of the cattle to look up briefly before returning to their grazing. "They're Angus cattle," John corrected gently. "Some of the finest in the county, just doing what they naturally do, grazing land that belongs to them." "Belongs to you," she snapped. "That's right," John agreed. "My land, my cattle, my choice how to use it, just like it would be your choice what to do with your property, if that camper were actually on your property." A soft murmur of approval rippled through the gathered neighbors. Ed Johnson didn't bother hiding his smile as he sipped from a thermos of coffee. Patricia surveyed the scene once more, calculation replacing some of the fury in her expression. "How much?" she finally asked. "Excuse me, how much to move your cows for an hour so I can get my camper?" John pretended to consider the offer. "Well, now that's not how cattle rotation works. They need at least 3 weeks in this pasture for proper grazing management. Moving them prematurely would disrupt their feeding patterns and could impact their health." 3 weeks. Patricia's composure finally cracked completely. "I can't wait 3 weeks. We leave for Yellowstone next Monday." "That does sound like a scheduling problem," John acknowledged, "though not one of my making." A phone rang, and Patricia snatched hers from her bag. Her face fell as she listened to the caller. From her side of the conversation, it became clear that her attorney had quickly assessed the situation and found it less than promising for any immediate legal remedy. As darkness settled over the field, Patricia made one final desperate attempt. She approached the fence, fishing a checkbook from her purse. "Name your price," she said, voice low enough that only John could hear. "Everyone has one." John studied her for a long moment, noting how different she looked now. Hair slightly disheveled, pristine outfit smudged from her field-side confrontation. The veneer of superiority cracked to reveal genuine desperation beneath. "You know," he said finally, "you're right about that. My price is simple. Respect for my property, my livelihood, and the boundaries that make good neighbors. That's something you can't write a check for, Patricia." He tipped his hat to her and turned away, leaving her standing at the fence line as the negotiator ambled over to investigate this human who smelled of unfamiliar perfume and familiar entitlement.